Is the Bible recap just kind of yet another popular, shallow, devotional Bible reading tool, or is there something more going on here? Well, let me give you my thoughts.
Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz.
Okay, I have here this is kind of a reissued, republished version of the very popular Bible recap by Leigh Cobble. And I want to say thank you to Bethany House for sending me this. I think this is like the travel version. It's got a pretty nice compact size to it, a nice cover. What I wanted to do, I'm gonna not go through my typical review format of main idea, research, readability, and all that stuff because it doesn't really fit this book project. And I just wanted to do something a little different and just give a couple minutes of just my thoughts about this, my kind of reaction to this. Because I want to do this in particular because the books I tend to read tend to be a little bit more on the academic level. They don't tend to be this kind of publication, to be honest. And yet I thought it would be worth just giving some of my thoughts on this because I've had a chance to peruse this for a little while now. So here we go. Let me just give you my thoughts. So the Bible recap, if you don't know what it is, the Bible recap, it is a one-year Bible reading plan. It's kind of, I believe it got started, I listened to a long interview with Leigh Cobble and heard some of the story. It sounds like it got started kind of as a podcast that she was doing. And it was really born out of her natural desire her own desire to read the Bible and understand it. And so she put together this whole framework it seems like it was a ton of work, this whole framework of putting together a plan to read the Bible in a year, a day at a time. But she wanted to do something a little different than there's a zillion read the Bible in a year plans and frameworks out there. And so she wanted to do something a little different. And so that's what the Bible recap is. And so I just want to give some thoughts about what I like about it and some, I don't know if critiques are the right word, but some other kind of ideas that I have about it that might be potential room for improvement or things at least to know if you are thinking about whether this would be worth your time if you're a Bible person. Okay, here we go. So the first thing that I want to say about this that I really, really like is that it is a narrative canonical approach to understanding the Bible. And so if you know what those terms mean, that's a very specific stream within biblical studies / theology that takes the biblical canon kind of as a given and isn't trying to get into source criticism or redaction criticism and getting into the textual critical issues of really trying to peel apart where did the text come from, more just to say let's just take it as a received kind of settled canon and then do theology with that as a given. So what that ends up meaning is you do a lot of narrative theology. So you take the whole story, you take the entirety of the canon, set aside a lot of which in my view, again, to be clear, I think those questions are quite valid and have a place to do that really deep textual critical scholarship. Biblical narrative canonical theology just doesn't do that so much, and it's more about how do we take the story that's given in Scripture and how do we do good theology out of that. So how does Scripture interpret other parts of Scripture? What are the pieces of continuity between books and between the Testaments and pieces of discontinuity? And let's kind of look at the big scope of the story, do theology through the lens of the narrative. And it's my favorite, personally, it's just my favorite type of theology to read. It's my favorite type of way to think about the Scriptures. I think it yields a lot of just amazing literary artistry. People like Robert Alter have been really pioneering in this. And on a popular level, the Bible Project is probably the most popular, well-known, that channel on YouTube is probably one of the most well-known examples of modern biblical theology, narrative theology. That's kind of what they do. And it's not a coincidence that someone involved in the Bible Project has endorsed the Bible recap. There's a lot of overlap there. So I really like that. I like that approach in general. And the reason I'm bringing this up and spending so much time on it is because I really like that there is a Bible reading plan that is explicitly through narrative theological thinking. I like that a lot. I think that's very commendable. I also like that it includes the entire Old Testament. So there was a big story of God movement. As I record this in 2023, there was a big story of God movement 10, 15-ish years ago. And sometimes those story movements, like books that came out, or even the Story NIV version of the NIV Bible, sometimes those story movements don't include some of the non-narrative texts like all the Psalms, all the Proverbs, or Ecclesiastes, some of the wisdom literature. Sometimes that stuff kind of gets short shrift in this narrative approach because they don't incline themselves towards narrative interpretation so easily. And the Bible recap includes all of that. I really like that. I like that all that stuff is included. The Psalms are threaded through the story of David, the story of Samuel, and she groups Psalms together and has you read them in certain days as you're going through the broader narrative of the kind of Old Testament Israelite story. I really, really like that all that is there. And that leads also to another good thing I like, which is that it's a really good structure for understanding what is confusing about especially the story of Israel. So like when the kingdoms separate post-Solomon in Israel, there's two different kingdoms at the same time. There's prophets that are in the north and the southern kingdoms that are all doing ministries at different times. It can be extraordinarily difficult to wrap your head around if you're just kind of opening up the Hebrew scriptures and reading them for yourself. It can be very, very confusing, and she has done a lot of work to structure stuff so that you can tell when Isaiah is doing his prophetic ministry, like which kingdom is kind of, what part of the story of the broader kingdom of Israel is this happening within. She's done a great service to the reader by structuring all that together so you can go through it a day at a time and really start to grasp, oh, this is how the whole complicated story of Israel played out. I think that's great. Page for page is highly readable style. I really appreciate that. And there is this, this is going to get a little bit into my, I don't like the word critique so much, but yeah, we'll say some critiques. This next thing straddles the line a little bit. I like it, but I also don't like it. She has every single page, there's this paragraph called the God shot, and that borderline's a little bit cliche cheesy for me. But I will say that I like the emphasis on basically what it is every time you do a selected reading, there's a page and a half of just kind of summary of the reading, and then there's this paragraph at the end that's called the God shot, which is a focus on God's character. So what are the kind of consistent attributes of God that show up through the story of the entirety of Scripture, and how do we see them in this particular reading we just did for this day? Which I think that can be great because especially there's a lot of dark, difficult prophetic texts, really in Old and New Testaments that you can kind of lose your way, and that God shot it's a good through line, I think. Even if I find the language maybe I wish it was maybe termed a little bit differently. So now a few things I want to say by way of just critique / being aware of if you're thinking about maybe picking this up. The narrative approach has a little bit of a shadow side, and it shows up here in this structure as well, in my view, and that sometimes, and this is where textual criticism can be really helpful on the other side of the coin, the narrative approach can sometimes flatten the differences between books that are making important points. So, for example, the progression of the story of Israel from Kings to Chronicles. Chronicles is a commentary on the way that the story of Kings is told. Chronicles is written later, it's written after the exile, and there's a lot of interesting theological nuances that you can see when you read it through the lens of like, oh, this is written later with a reflection on the exile that's kind of nuancing and complicating the theology of Israel. Sometimes, and I see it a little bit in this Bible recap, sometimes it can flatten some of those differences. Another example is the Gospels. She takes a chronological approach to the Gospel story, so you kind of read chapters of all 4 Gospels all at the same time and just go through the life of Jesus chronologically, which is great for just getting the story, but it can flatten. There are important theological distinctions between the 4 Gospels. It's why all 4 were preserved in the canon, because they accentuate and emphasize different aspects of the life of Christ. And that gets flattened a little bit when you read it strictly chronologically, just like some of that stuff in the Old Testament gets flattened a little bit. So it's just something to be aware of when you go into it. Also, I wish... she's clearly done a lot of homework, and there's a tension here because this is pitched to be very popular, very accessible, which is a good thing. Especially because it's a popular, accessible example of the narrative theological approach I was talking about. And she's clearly done a lot of homework. However, she's pitched it as also being like, kind of, I'm not a scholar. I'm just trying to explain the Bible. I'm just trying to make it approachable, make it simple, which I think that's commendable. But she's also done a lot of homework, and she talks about things like archaeology, and she makes historical and theological judgments in pretty much every page when she summarizes here's what you just read, here's what it means. She's making judgments there. And that's not a bad thing, that's unavoidable. I want to be clear. I don't think it's a bad thing that she's making those judgments. Her judgments skew towards a more conservative, traditional, conservative evangelical kind of lens, which is fine. That's not the critique is not that she's doing that. The critique is that I wish it was a little bit clearer where she was getting those judgments from. I wish that there was some more here's a source that impacted me in making this decision, or here are some other ways to view this judgment that I'm making. I guess what I'm saying is I wish it was a little more academic, which maybe that's not fair, because maybe that's not what the Bible recap is really supposed to be, or even is trying to do, or not what she's trying to do. But she has made judgments, and I wish, I guess, it was just a little bit clearer where those judgments came from, and I wish she could have foregrounded some of the research and homework that she did, because that's very clear that she did it. So that's a little bit of a tension, I guess, around the whole project. But that all being said, I really think that in the world of just tons and tons and tons of these things, like how to read the Bible in a year, all these plans that exist, I do think this one sets itself apart in that it is that narrative approach. I really, really love the structure and scaffolding she's created for someone to especially read through the Old Testament, which the majority of this, I mean, you get almost to day 300. It's like day 275 or something before you even get to the New Testament. So it's like most of your year is going to be reading the Old Testament anyways. And I would really commend this as a way to get into, if you want to read even just the entire Old Testament in a year, I think this is a really, really helpful tool. And just keeping in mind, especially if you're like me and you're into the more of the academic side and the academic kind of background and homework behind all this stuff, just keep in mind some of those things that I said, because there are ways that these judgments could have gone differently. And that's not a critique of the project per se, that's just something to be aware of as you go into it. But those are my thoughts on the Bible Recap by Leigh Cobble. It's a wonderful tool that exists. I'm really glad it's out there with everything that I just said in mind. If that's something that's of interest to you, if you're looking for something that might jumpstart your own study of Scripture, your own enjoyment of Scripture, I think this is a really, really worth looking at. So there you go. Those are my thoughts on the Bible Recap by Leigh Cobble. As always, thank you for watching.